You're listening to the Stand Out Now podcast with your host, Dave Mendonca. Check out each episode as top experts share their proven marketing, publicity, and sales tips to help you cut through the advertising noise so you can reach your ideal clients, get noticed, and connect with powerful influencers. The Stand Out Now podcast is brought to you by podcastinterviewexperts.com, helping entrepreneurs attract clients through business podcast guest appearances.
Greetings. Thank you for listening. Our guest is an executive producer podcast for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He helps develop and launch original podcasts for the CBC. Arif Noorani, welcome to the show.
Hi, hope you're doing well.
I am, and I hope you're doing well, sir.
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Awesome. Now, Arif, what I typically do with guests, I start off with this question. They find it reflective. Some find it funny. So let's see what your take is. Okay, here we go. When you were a kid, what marketing or sales strategies, knowingly or unknowingly, did you use to get what you wanted?
Yeah, I thought about that, and I realized I've been doing it my whole life in terms of promotion, like publicly promoting yourself and what you have to offer. And when I was 14, I think I knew I wanted to be in journalism because I helped start my school newspaper. So I approached the local newspaper called Pennysaver, and it was a weekly free thing. And I pitched myself as a movie reviewer back when I was 14, and they actually accepted and said yes. And I started writing movie reviews. I approached them and positioned myself in terms of what I could offer. As I was thinking about this interview, I was like, yeah, I think I've been doing that my whole life, like identifying what I can bring, then getting the skills to offer that if I don't have all of them, and then not being afraid to put yourself in front of someone. So, I was a 14-year-old that approached a newspaper editor and just asked for something, and they accepted it. So, yeah, and I think that's kind of been my unconscious, subconscious approach to my career.
Wow. Take us back, 14 years old. So why pitch yourself to Pennysaver as a movie reviewer? I guess you're a big movie fan in the day. Like, what was the driver there?
Yeah, I think when I was in English class, we had to write essays and reviews, and I would often do reviews of popular culture, so books and movies, and did that, and TV as well, and did that for my school paper. I thought, well, I should do it for the community paper. And so I'm interested in pop culture. I had things to say. I always had a point of view on all of that. And it seemed to nicely align with that. And then years later, I also then, as part of my high school placement program, I did a business focus in high school as well as academic on the business side. I got myself placed at the Georgia Straight, which is the weekly arts, culture, news magazine in Vancouver, and did the same thing. Now, I didn't get to write reviews for them because they're such a high caliber of experience you need, but I became a copy editor as part of my placement over 4 months.
See, it's interesting. Being like a 14-year-old at that time, like your confidence levels, usually 14-year-olds don't have that kind of confidence to put themselves out there. Were you always a confident person growing up? A lot of kids that age would just shy away from something like that.
Yeah, it was funny on a kind of social level. I was a bit more of an introvert, right, with my peers and people my own age. But I think I always felt confident in my kind of intellectual abilities, and my mother was very reinforcing of that. So, yeah, I think I've been fearless in that way. And sometimes, you get burned. Like, I ran for student council president, and I didn't even, I didn't get elected. And I look back at my time, and I think I never put filters on myself, or I never put up barriers that were probably there. And so once in a while, I would hit the barrier and didn't get what I wanted. But I think more often than not, I approached life more fearlessly when it came to intellectual or professional or creative pursuits. And I've always had that with me. I can't pinpoint exactly what are the pieces that came together to make that, but that's been part of my DNA for such a long time.
Right. So you can't give like specific ingredients as to how to be fearless. Because what if there is an introvert out there listening and they're wondering, I want to put myself out there more?
Some of the things I would say are look at your own skills and talent, what you have to offer, and then kind of imagine what job or career or path you want and kind of visualize it and think about it. And then think about what I need to learn to get that and get it, whether it's training or experience or reading up in knowledge, and then put yourself out there as that person. So I do think there are steps that introvert, extrovert, anyone can do. It's harness what your talents are, imagine what you want to be, and get what you need and do it. And my feeling always is there's a sort of I think we have this idea that certain types of jobs are unattainable or we'll never get there. And I think when you get to the other side, you realize, no, like it's, to be a CEO is a mix of having some business savvy and this and that. Like most jobs, except being a brain surgeon or, even being a lawyer, most jobs you can actually teach yourself if you have the aptitude. So I would say all of us can take away that, right? That you can get where you want to be if you're determined and you do the hard work. So, I think 5 years ago, I said to myself, you know what? I want to be a kind of podcast expert. I know this is where audio and storytelling is going. And I kind of immerse myself in it. And now I do feel like I'm an expert in it from a kind of aesthetic editorial point of view, but also strategy and audience building. So I'm hoping people can take away that from what I'm sharing.
In regards to journalism, you were interested in journalism by you being at Ryerson University, studying there. Why journalism? Why did it appeal to you?
Yeah, I think it's one of those examples of how an early influence can shift your life in one direction or the other. And so when I was in grade 8 and 9, I remember as I mentioned in my English classes, doing these reviews. And then my teacher said, oh, you should help us start a school newspaper. We didn't actually have one at the school. We were more of a working class, arts and sports centered school. And so with her, we started a kind of a journalism newspaper class where you produced a newspaper. So it was her kind of influence. And I think if I had a teacher who said, you should be a lawyer, you have an analytical mind, which is another career path, was thinking about at one point, I would have done that instead. So It was sort of, I had an early influence on, we're an immigrant family. We came here. So I was very open and susceptible to, someone helping me guide my path. My mom wanted me to be a dentist, and that was of no interest to me. So I think my interest in journalism came from that point, and then it just built, and I sort of just built my identity around it, right? Like I read lots of different types of newspapers and media and thought about what kind of journalist do I want to be, and it just built from there. And everything I've done is centered around that. Like, so my interest in podcasting is a kind of journalist, as someone who sees the media as one of the major pillars in our society to help tell stories and to uncover injustice, to entertain, to inform, and build from there. So Ryerson was my formal training around that, and got involved with community radio. Then also very early on in the 90s, I moved into the digital sphere. I was a editor for a website in the late 90s when we thought the internet was going to be everything. And then the tech crash wiped a lot of that out. And finally, 15 years later, we've come around to a world where the internet is everything. But in 1999, we actually thought it was everything back then, right? And it did a little detour.
Right. Didn't you get into the CBC in 2000, just after 99?
Yes, that's right. So in 1999, I was a web editor, and then the tech crash happened. And for the 90s, I did a lot of work in NGOs and the arts sector. And I said to myself, I'm not going to take another job in those sectors because I could easily just, end up becoming a festival organizer or working in NGOs. And I said, I'm going to wait for the right opportunity. And eventually, someone I knew that worked at the CBC. CBC is a hard place to figure out how to get into. When people ask me how to do it, I don't always know. Like it's so big yet so unclear. But I had a friend who worked in network radio, and she said, well, there's a 6-month paid internship. You have, radio experience, journalism experience. why don't you apply? And I applied and I got lots of tips from her on what the interviewers would want to hear, right? Like what,
Sure.
And I got my foot in the door there. And I think when I came, they realized, oh, he has lots of experience, right? And I ended up becoming a producer after the 6 months. And then 5 years later became an executive producer and filled in as senior producer. So I quickly moved up, but it's because I also had 10 years of this other adjacent experience outside of the CBC after J School. And then since then, it's just been, lots of opportunities. It was, a little bit of luck and happenstance of how I got in. I made a choice, though. I'm not going to take a job in this other arena where I know I don't want to spend the rest of my life in. And I think if I had not done that, I might not have ended at the CBC. Although, a side note story, when I came out of J School, I got a job at a human rights NGO, and someone from the CBC, this was in 93, did call me with an offer of an internship, and I turned it down because I had this other job. So I had kind of missed that opportunity earlier. So, but yeah, the road to where you want to be is always not straightforward.
Yes, for sure. So, talking about the CBC, I have some American listeners, and for those of you that don't know the CBC, it's kind of like the BBC of Canada. It's like its own little universe. Like, I've walked past the CBC many times in downtown Toronto. Wouldn't you say it's like its own little city?
Exactly, yeah. It very much, everyone at the CBC in Toronto works in one building, and in that building you have people who work in the French language services, you have people who work in sports, who work in drama and entertainment, who work only in digital, who do other people who just work on kids programming. And it's this kind of microcosm of a multi-layer broadcast network, right? That is TV, radio, digital, but then also we have multiple native indigenous languages. What I love about working here is I've been here now 18 years. It's almost like you can have a new job every few years if you want, but still work for the same company. Because I could, I decided to do podcasting a few years ago, and I might, say I want to work in scripted and dramatic television, and you can find a way to get in there if you have the skill set. So yeah, it is its own little world.
For sure. So, Arif, where is your department in the totem pole of things at CBC? I'm very familiar with media. I've been a reporter, all that sort of thing in Toronto and whatnot. So I understand the landscape. I'm just curious to see where podcasts sit. Because I know in Canada, I'm finding is that podcasts haven't quite landed yet. We seem to be a bit behind. We're getting there.
Yeah.
So like within the CBC landscape, how do the higher ups treat podcasts?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think they treat it with respect. Well, I think they respect it and excited by it because we've had quite a few hits, and that's why they do it, I think. Sort of our shows like Someone Knows Something or Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo or Uncover. Between them, they've had over 180 million downloads in the last 3 years. So I think there's an understanding that this is a growing area. I do agree with you. We're playing catch up by a couple of years in terms of podcast monetization and advertising and the emergence of across the board in Canada. I think we are now starting to see lots of high quality podcasts being produced outside of the CBC in Canada. And some of those we're actually bringing in-house. We're seeing more and more of that. In terms of where we fit in the hierarchy, we technically fall under radio. So CBC Radio, the network level, funded our department of 4 years ago of creating like original podcasts. And since then, we've just kind of grown and grown because of, the success of our shows. So we technically fall under radio. I think there will become a day where it will be its separate own entity. But that's where we fall in the hierarchy. But a real understanding that podcasting is important. So CBC News has created a podcast strategy, and we work with them. And we launched Front Burner, which is our daily news podcast hosted by Jamie Poisson. So other parts of the company are embracing it, and we're working with them to help them.
And that's great to hear because in this country, it just doesn't feel like podcasting is taken seriously enough. I'm glad to hear that a big entity like CBC is starting to recognize the value. Now, with your particular position, what exactly do you do? Do you do scripting? Are you just supervising? What is an executive producer do, or what do they do at CBC Podcasts?
Yeah, so what I do is I kind of oversee all the creation and execution and production of all our series. So from the creation part, we take pitches from folks or work with talent to develop ideas and help pilot them and grow them and create the teams around them, and the creative direction I oversee, and then we help launch them. And as they are kind of releasing episodes at a higher level, I vet the scripts. So I make sure that the scripts and rough cuts I've listened to and provide notes on that, or make sure there's someone there to provide them and keep them focused on the direction we've all agreed to. I also then oversee our strategy. We're such a small department that, a few of us do a lot of it, but the strategy on how big is our slate? What genres do we want? We have true crime, we have personal storytelling. What are we missing? But also thinking about smart speakers and how we want to connect to that. Do we want to grow our audiences internationally? Where do we want to do it? So strategy is a big part of it. And then there's lots of the kind of staffing and admin and organizational stuff I oversee. But now I have a senior producer who really helps with a lot of that. So she's now taken on a lot of the staffing stuff because now we have 20 plus series, and that's a lot of different people and moving parts. Up until a year ago, I would do all of that, and when we only had about 8 or 9 series. But now that we're this big, I have a senior producer who does that. And then we're slowly building our department now that we have 7 core people who help run it. And then each show has 3 to 4 people that work on it while it's in production. At the end of the line, the buck stops with me and the senior director of podcasts, who's my boss. And together we're responsible for everything that goes out there. So we have to make sure we're in tune with what's being made and what's being put out there, and that it aligns with our strategy.
Are you also in charge of promoting the podcast? If so, how do you promote them?
Yeah, so that's another part that I've had to do just because we were so small. And CBC has a marketing department, but their experience has been more in TV largely, right? Because that's where you need advertising dollars. And so now we count on them for some help in terms of publicity and a bit of outreach. But internally, we've also had to be really creative about audience building. And we like to say, like with podcasts, you start with an audience of 0. So in terms of how we market it, it's so robust. Like I could spend 3 hours talking to you about all the different things we do. So we grab every opportunity we can. So this is one opportunity, right? Like if hopefully people hear about what we do and want to check out what we do. So we find podcast to podcast outreach is a very effective way. So we do a lot of cross promotion with like-minded podcasts that are external to us. So pre-rolls or mid-rolls where one true art, someone knows something might promote In the Dark or another true crime podcast or a podcast about kind of personal storytelling around love and relationships, that we do that. So every show has a producer whose job it is to find those cross promo opportunities. So it's mostly these ads. Now that we're venturing into arena where we have more talk show or talk format podcasts, we're going to try to get our hosts on other talk podcasts where it makes sense. Mm-hmm. So we also have a huge list of what we call podcast influencers. And it's a list of over 200 people or blogs that cover podcasting. So for Nick Qua from Hot Pod or James Cridland from Pod News. And when we have a new series out or something noteworthy, we send them information. So that producer is assigned to doing that, making sure it's in front of everyone, like what we're making is in front of their ears. And we keep on adding to that, right? So one thing I'm going to do this week is I'm going to go through all the best of year lists, right? Not just that covered us, but everything, and make sure all those media outlets are on our outreach list. And I have to say, this past end of year, I saw more best of year lists in total than I've ever seen before, like in general, right? There's so much more meat covering it, right?
Yep.
So you spoke to like Canada not taking podcasting seriously. Like I would say CBC has been taking it seriously for the last 4 years. I feel the rest of the Canadian media is only starting to take it seriously. Like the Globe and Mail, until a year ago, didn't have someone who covered podcasting, and now they have someone who's a freelancer who, we reach out to. I find the Toronto Star and the national media have been slow to the uptake in actually telling the stories around this medium that's a mix of entertainment and informative and all that. So in terms of the kind of audience building, we're no more of an advantage than an independent producer, because to find that audience, you are starting from zero, and a lot of those listeners aren't the ones who say watch network television, right? That network television viewer is much older. We're kind of having to be as inventive and creative as anyone else.
Right. Also, things like SEO, even like small things like keywords and like your ad copy, stuff like that. Is that something that the marketing department focuses on at all, or do you guys give much mention to? Or
yeah, they create the drafts and then we vet them and make sure they reflect what we're making.
Sure.
So that's part of it. I would say we're not as advanced on using like Google AdWords and all that as others are. For the longest time, we were actually doing, if we did paid marketing, we were doing Facebook, paid social. And then I went to Podcast Movement last year. I don't know if you've been to it, but I would encourage lots of people to attend to it. It's an annual conference of over 3,000 people involved in podcasting. And it was clear from that the best money spent is podcast to podcast money. So I've been encouraging our marketing folks to not necessarily buy, do paid social, but actually buy an ad on a podcast we couldn't access otherwise and try to get the word out there. I feel that's more effective than someone seeing something on Instagram or in a Google or paid Twitter spot. I think that stuff is good for maybe raising your profile a bit, but if you actually want a listener, you have to go to where other listeners are.
That's a great point, Arif. The listeners to this podcast, many of them are entrepreneurs, and they're trying to get their brand out there. And definitely, in my opinion, podcasting is one of the ways to do it. In your opinion, why is that? Why should like an entrepreneur seriously consider having podcasting as part of their marketing strategy?
If you're an entrepreneur in any kind of field that's a bit more creative or where there's a public, you have public element to it, I think a podcast is a great way to let others know about you rather than a resume or a splashy website. I think it's a chance for people to connect with who you are in a kind of authentic way. And I think that is where I think the value is. There's two streams of podcasting in my mind. There's the kind that we do that is more, we're trying to create the HBO of, content and, highly produced. And then there's that huge other stream, which is much bigger, where people it's an extension of their social media. And so rather than just having Instagram and Twitter or Facebook, their podcast is the way they talk to the world. And I think it gives you so much more opportunity to be more than 4 sentences or kind of superficial. So I think it's a good way to build your brand if you are working in an area where you're going to have to interact with people. So if you are an expert in a certain area or a topic. So
for sure. Have you personally ever purchased anything off a podcast?
No, I don't think.
Really?
No, I don't consume a lot of things. Like I'm getting to the age where I'm trying to declutter my life rather than add it. I think with the podcast, I'm aware of brands that I considered. So like, Casper mattresses is an example. Like I would never know them. And then when I looked at them, I thought, oh, a mattress that you can fold up into a little bag. I'm not, like for me, that's not the kind of mattress I wanted.
Sure.
The food delivery services, a lot of them I would hear are ones you couldn't get in Canada. Like, I mentioned that point earlier that where advertising is struggling to keep up. I think if there was one that was in Canada, I would have tried it because I've tried them, but not because I heard it on a podcast. So the way advertising works is you have to hear something and be introduced to it at least 7 times in different ways.
Sure.
And so podcast ad is one of those 7 times. And then eventually it becomes a viable option for you when it comes, when you are trying to choose your next mattress or food delivery service or car or whatever.
So, Arif, you're a busy guy. You're trying to declutter your life. What podcasts have made their way into your consciousness that you listen to them regularly? Which ones have captured your attention?
Yeah, I would say one of my favorites is In the Dark. It's an investigative crime podcast from APM. And the first season looked at the case of this missing child from the 70s whose disappearance led to, the milk cartons with people with the faces of missing children. It kind of led to that phenomenon. And that case went down this journey where it looked at that shift, but also looked at sheriff's departments across the country and their success rates in solving crime. And Madeline Barron is the host of that. And her second season is looking at this case of Curtis Flowers, who's a man who was arrested of murdering a number of people. And he appealed his conviction and it got overturned because of not enough evidence. But the prosecutor in that area kept on retrying him. So he's had to go back to the court 6 different times and he's been in prison the whole time. And now his case is being looked at by the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's partly, I think, because of the podcast. So that's a big favorite of mine. For another one I really like it's now one of ours, but it's called Secret Life of Canada. And it's a podcast that looks at the kind of history of this country that but the stories you don't. So one of their episodes looks at the Hudson Bay blanket, which is so iconic for a lot of us, and looked at how it was brought over to North America. It was a symbol of the relationship between Indigenous people and those who were coming from Europe and the complicated history around it. And what I like about that series is it's actually humorous, right? The hosts have a wit to them and they tell you history in a way that's really interesting and they crack jokes. They're not afraid to crack jokes, but it's very well researched at the same time. So I would really encourage people to check that out, Secret Life of Canada. Even if you're from the States, around the world, it's just really kind of entertaining listening, but you also learn about history.
For sure. Now, what's your take on this, Arif? So I'm seeing podcast production companies like Wondery, right? Wondery, they're pumping out these true crime, like Dirty John kind of shows, and you have Hollywood knocking on the door. Yeah. Now, do you want your CBC podcast to grab the attention of Hollywood?
First of all, they partly have been grabbing the attention behind the scenes. So we have, like, Personal Best is one of our kind of comedy series, and we have an agent in Los Angeles who is working on shopping around a TV concept for it. I would say we're interested in adaptations of our series, and it's not just Hollywood. Like, as you know, CBC has our own drama department, our own, we make kind of TV drama series. So we've been talking about Someone Knows Something and adapting that as a dramatic production, and we have a independent production company who's interested. So we are interested in our intellectual property being spun out in different ways. We're very, though, kind of clear that we want it to be at the same level of quality as our series themselves. So if we're going to create a TV production, we want it to be a kind of high level Netflix content or HBO. Like, we want it to be done that way rather than a police procedural that's just on, regular television. On a weekly basis, we get at least one request from external for one of our series. So Uncover is the most popular. So Escaping Nexium was our first season, and that launched in September. It's a story of Nexium, which is this self-help group that ended up being an alleged cult for many of the people in it. And now the leaders of it, which include Allison Mack, who was in Smallville, on TV. She's one of the leaders. She's been arrested by the U.S. government. When that launched, every week we were getting at least 3 requests from production companies who wanted to do an adaptation. So we're working with the people who are featured in that series to look at those offers. So we are interested. And I wish we had more bandwidth to pursue it more. I'm also interested in other types of adaptations, like a book. So Secret Life of Canada, the 2 hosts are actually working on a book based on one of their episodes. One of my predictions for 2019, I did some predictions, is I think podcasts will lead and shape many different types of sectors. So not just the TV film, which you referenced, like, Golden Globes had 2 podcast turned movies and TV shows nominated. So I think that will continue happening, but I think we'll also see it as a venue where maybe a political candidate emerges, right? That someone who builds their kind of community and profile through their podcast, and they resonate, and then they run for political office. So I'm very interested and excited to see where podcasting goes in the next few years and how it influences other parts of culture.
Well, it's incredibly exciting, Arif. You guys at CBC Podcasts are doing some great work. Thank you so much for this chat. Where can people find out more about you and CBC Podcasts?
Our website is cbc.ca/podcasts. So if you go there, you get a kind of overview of all our podcasts. And then also there's an about section where you can find out about our whole team, all of us who work on them and what we do.
Terrific. Arif, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It was great chatting with you.
Awesome. Everybody out there, thank you for checking out this episode. Enjoy your week.
Thank you for listening to the Stand Out Now podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and rate and review it as well. You can find out more about our program at thestandoutnowpodcast.com. Thanks again and enjoy your week.